We're about to begin a brand new love journey. Please comment on where you're watching from so we can see that our soul stories families all around the world. Early autumn mornings in Vermont always carried a kind of weary clarity, as if the world itself were breathing a little slower. Pale gray light slipped through the curtains and fell across Clara Monroe's cluttered desk. Sketches, pencils, a half-empty coffee cup, and a single white envelope lying in the middle, standing out like an uninvited memory. Clara couldn't recall hearing the mail carrier. She only noticed the envelope sitting there, silent, unassuming, yet heavy enough to alter the air in the room. There was no sender's name, only an address written in neat, feminine handwriting she didn't recognize. Her heart tightened. It felt like someone had just called her name from the past. She picked it up, turned it over, and then carefully tore open the edge. A pristine white card slipped out and fell onto the desk. The elegant, thinly printed words hit her like a blow. Ethan Monroe and Isabella Hart joyfully invite you to their wedding. October 17th, the Waldorf Astoria, New York. Clara froze. For several seconds, the world fell silent. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall and her own shallow, uneven breathing remained. His name, the man who used to be her husband, the man who once said he would love her until the last building on earth collapsed. She thought she had forgotten. She thought 5 quiet years were enough for memories to turn into dust. But seeing his name again, everything resurfaced. Not loud, just painfully deep. She sank into her chair. The slanting morning light touched her hair, casting a reflection of exhaustion in her eyes. Her fingers trembled as they brushed the printed letters, afraid they might disappear. Or worse, that they were still real. Who had sent it? Not him. Ethan never dealt with small, trivial things. Not mutual friends. Those had long vanished from her life. Maybe someone on the guest list had mistaken the address. Or maybe he wanted her to know. Her lips pressed together. The thought made her chest ache. Does he want me to see his happiness? To know he's moved on while I'm still standing in place? No tears came, but her throat closed as if she had swallowed glass. Clara stood and walked to the window. Outside, fog blanketed the hills and the maple trees at the end of the street were turning honey gold. He once told her, "If you ever get tired of New York, we'll move to Vermont. I'll draw and you'll plant lavender." She had believed him, and he had forgotten. Clara leaned her forehead against the cold glass. Her breath left a faint trace on the surface, then faded. There was something bitterly ironic about it. He was about to marry someone else while she still lived in the town where he had once promised to build our home. She turned back to the desk, staring once more at the card. The morning light caught the ink of his name, Ethan Monroe, making it glow as if still alive, still powerful enough to unsteady her heart with just 2 words. A small, wry smile curved her lips, more sorrowful than bitter, and softly, as if speaking only to herself, she murmured, "Maybe he wants me to see his happiness. Maybe he wants me to know that, after all, he's fine." She set the card down, but didn't put it away. She knew she would look at it again, if only to make sure the pain was still there, to remind herself how deeply she had once loved a man like him. On the bookshelf, an old photo frame caught the light. In the picture, Ethan was smiling, that radiant kind of smile that lit his whole face, while she hid behind a large blueprint. It was taken the year they designed the first Monroe Atelier headquarters. He had kissed her forehead and said, "When this building is finished, I'll marry you right on the rooftop." And he had. But that building now belonged to someone else, and that rooftop was only a shadow. Clara pulled out her chair again, sat at the desk, and opened her notebook. On the blank page, she wrote 3 simple words in slanted, fragile handwriting. 5 years ago. Just 3 words. But they opened a floodgate. The smell of New York rain, his voice arguing with hers over a blueprint. The night he walked out, taking with him a wedding ring still dusted with paint. She stopped writing. Her fingers were stained with ink, her eyes stung. No crying, no tears, only silence. Some invitations are not meant to be answered. Some are sent by fate, not to reopen the wound, but to see if your heart still remembers the way back. She closed her eyes, leaned back in the chair, and exhaled softly. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wood and the distant chime of a church bell. An old chapter was quietly reopening, not because she wanted it to, but because fate wasn't done with it yet. 5 years earlier, in New York, autumn arrived more slowly. The trees along Fifth Avenue were only half golden, and the sunlight was still warm enough to make people believe summer hadn't truly gone. Clara Monroe was 27 then, a young, energetic, daring interior architect whose eyes always lit up when she spoke about space, light, and people. She saw every building as a living body. Every line, every curve had to carry a soul. That was what caught Ethan Monroe's attention the first time they met at the project briefing for the New York Modern Art Museum. He was 32, already one of the most renowned figures among the new generation of architects, founder of Monroe Atelier, a design studio famous for its creations that were as sleek and modern as they were cold, much like the man himself. Ethan was known as the mind of steel and glass, logical, precise, never letting emotions interfere with design. And she was his perfect opposite. She laughed in the middle of dry meetings. She placed a small vase of flowers on a concrete model and said, "Every space needs something soft, something that makes people want to live in it." Ethan had looked at her for a long time, and for the first time in years realized he was smiling. They started with work, then slowly slipped into each other's lives, as if it had been drawn into the blueprint all along. He often brought her coffee early in the morning, while she was still sketching light compositions. She teased him, "You drink black coffee like you're sipping other people's sleepiness." He raised an eyebrow. "And you drink lattes like you're sipping hope." They laughed. That laughter, echoing through a room of concrete and metal, felt like sunlight breaking through glass, small but warming everything it touched. When the museum was completed, critics called it a rare blend of logic and soul. At the grand opening, Ethan said, "If architecture is a body, then she, Clara, is its heartbeat." That night, he took her to the rooftop where the city lights poured down like streams of stars. The breeze brushed her hair against his neck, and for the first time, he kissed her. "I think this is the first project I never want to leave," he whispered. "Why?" "Because you're in it." They married 6 months later, a small, simple ceremony, drenched in light. Their friends said they were the couple that made people believe in the idea that opposites can complete each other. Ethan was logical. Clara was emotional. He was structured. She was breathless. Together, they made everything seem perfect. But sometimes perfection is the very thing that breaks everything apart. As the firm grew, so did the pressure. Monroe Atelier opened international branches, and Ethan began to live by a schedule instead of feeling. Dinners turned into meetings. Conversations turned into debates. Clara still loved her work, but she began to feel suffocated in his world. A world measured by efficiency, budgets, and prestige. She wanted to preserve humanity in design. He wanted control, to ensure everything met his definition of flawless. One late night at the studio, while she adjusted the color palette for a children's space, he said, "It's not pure enough." "It's a space for kids, Ethan. It needs warmth, not purity. Anything bearing the Monroe Atelier name must be perfect." She set down her pencil and looked at him for a long time. "And what about our love? Does that have to be perfect too?" He said nothing. The question never got an answer. From that day, a distance grew between them. Not an explosion, just a thin, silent crack. Like a sheet of glass. Still beautiful, still intact to outsiders, but one soft tap away from shattering. Clara began drawing on her own. She started a small side project called Home of Light, creating designs for ordinary homes. Unglamorous but warm. Ethan didn't oppose her, but he didn't care either. He only said, "You should focus on something of greater value." The night they fought the hardest was over her refusal to alter her design for a library for children with disabilities. He said, "You're letting emotion ruin the project." She replied, "And you're letting ego ruin this marriage." The door slammed behind her, the last sound between them for months. They divorced quietly. No drama, no tears, no one begging the other to stay. Just two people who had loved each other so much that they no longer realized they were hurting each other in the name of love. In the divorce papers, he wrote simply, "No longer share the same vision." Clara signed without rereading. She left New York on a foggy, rainy morning, carrying a few sketches, a photo frame, and a wound she couldn't yet name. Ethan let her go, not because he stopped loving her, but because he hadn't yet learned how to love without control. And she walked away, not because she wanted to forget, but because she knew staying would mean losing herself. The woman who once made him laugh, who once brought color into his world. For the next 5 years, they didn't speak to each other. No messages, no greetings, no explanations. Only silence where memories slept, waiting for a nameless white envelope to wake them again. Clara Monroe's decision did not come from impulse. It came after 3 sleepless nights, 3 cups of cold coffee, and 3 times opening her desk drawer just to look again at that wedding invitation. The one with his familiar name. She didn't go out of curiosity. She went because she needed to see with her own eyes whether the past had truly come to an end. If her heart could remain still in the face of what once shattered it, then perhaps, at last, she was free. The afternoon of the wedding bathed New York in golden autumn light. The sun spilled over skyscrapers, glinting like 1,000 thin blades, sharp, cold, and beautiful. The Waldorf Astoria shimmered in ivory white. Lilies covered the entrance, and a line of luxury cars stretched down the street, as if other people's memories had come to witness a new beginning. Clara stepped out of a taxi. Her pale silver dress brushed softly against her heels. No extravagance, no jewelry, just a woman who had learned how to look calm in front of things that no longer belonged to her. She had chosen the dress because it resembled cooled moonlight, once bright, once belonging to a sky of its own, but now just a kind of light that asked for no one to notice. The moment she entered the lobby, she felt the weight of dozens of glances. The sound of violins murmured in the air, mingling with champagne and rose petals. Then came the whispers, small but sharp as glass. "Is that Clara Monroe?" The groom's ex-wife. "Oh God, why would she come?" Clara heard every word but didn't flinch. She walked slowly, as if she were nothing more than a distant guest, there to witness 2 old friends begin their new chapter. She found a quiet corner near the marble columns, where the golden light didn't reach. On the stage stood Ethan Monroe, in a perfectly tailored black suit, holding a bouquet of white flowers. The chandelier's light touched his hair, making him look like he'd stepped out of an old photograph she once kept in her office. He hadn't changed much except for something in his eyes. The quiet exhaustion of a man who had once had everything and lost the one thing that mattered most. As the officiant began to speak, Ethan turned toward his bride, Isabella Hart, graceful, radiant, pure in her white gown. Everything seemed flawless until someone near the stage murmured, "Ethan, I think someone's watching you." He turned, their eyes met. In that instant, the music stopped. At least in their world it did. The room was full of people, yet it felt like only the 2 of them remained, standing across an ocean of time, caught between what was and what would never be again. His hand trembled. The ring slipped slightly from his fingers. Ethan pressed his lips together, trying to hold himself steady, but his gaze betrayed him. It stayed locked on the woman in the corner, the one he thought he had forgotten, but never truly did. Clara didn't move. She didn't hide, didn't smile. Just a small nod. Enough to say, "I'm fine without words." Then she turned and began to leave. But as she walked away, there came the faint sound of something falling, the soft ring of metal against marble. The room went still. Ethan stood frozen, bouquet clutched too tightly, eyes still fixed on her retreating silhouette. "Ethan?" Isabella's voice trembled. He didn't answer. Only when he felt the eyes of the crowd did he quietly bend down, pick up the bouquet, his hands shaking so hard that a few petals fell away. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I just need some air." He stepped down from the altar, leaving behind the bride, and the murmurs that dared not become words. Clara had reached the lobby when she heard footsteps behind her. His voice followed, low, hurried, as if he feared time itself would close the distance before he could. "Clara." She stopped, didn't turn. That voice, so achingly familiar, made her heartbeat stumble against her ribs. "Why did you come?" The question held more than curiosity. It carried ache, guilt, a silent plea hidden beneath the calm of a man who once believed he had no feelings left. She turned at last, her eyes steady. "Because I needed to know if I'd truly forgotten you." Ethan let out a faint broken laugh, though his eyes glistened. "And did you find your answer?" "I did," she said softly, "but it's probably not the one you were hoping for." A gust from the revolving door swept through, lifting the ribbon on her dress until it brushed his hand. Both stood motionless. For that moment, every sound, music, chatter, crystal light faded into the distance. Only two souls remained, standing in the ruins of something once whole, knowing that even a single glance could bring it all back to life. "I didn't think you'd come." "And she smiled faintly, "didn't think you'd tremble." He lowered his head, a fragile smile crossing his lips, but his eyes were breaking. "I thought I could forget you, Clara." "You only thought so." They stood there for just a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. Then she stepped back, her voice quiet, almost a whisper only he could hear. "The best thing I can do for you is to walk away." She turned and stepped into the revolving door. The light caught her silver dress, and for a fleeting instant, she looked like moonlight slipping out of the night. Gentle, but leaving the whole room missing something it could never name. Ethan stood still, didn't follow. His hands clenched white. His bride, Isabella, still waited inside the ballroom, surrounded by uneasy whispers. And he, the man of logic, precision, and plans, for the first time in his life, no longer knew where he stood. Night fell over New York like a faint cut across silk. In the bridal dressing suite on the 15th floor of the Waldorf Astoria, Isabella Hart sat alone, quietly facing the mirror. On the vanity lay open lipsticks, a slightly wilted bridal bouquet under the heat of the lamps, and a wedding ring resting in a black velvet box. It no longer shone as it had that afternoon. Only a dim reflection remained, like love examined too closely until its innocence faded away. Outside, a soft drizzle began to fall. The city was still awake, but her heart was not. The door creaked open. Her young assistant stepped in, eyes darting nervously, and asked softly, "Miss Isabella, the ceremony can still continue if you wish. Everyone's waiting for your decision." Isabella smiled faintly, but the smile never reached her eyes. "Continue? For what purpose?" The assistant hesitated. After a pause, she whispered, "Are you sure you want to stop?" Maybe he was just overwhelmed. Isabella looked into the mirror, the reflection staring back at her. A woman in a flawless white gown, beautiful but unflinchingly clear-eyed. Her voice was calm, tired but gentle. "I don't want to marry a man who has to pretend he's forgotten someone else." She turned her chair toward the assistant, her tone steady, deliberate. "I only want him to realize he's not ready for a new promise." When the assistant left, the room fell silent. Isabella removed her veil, laid it gently on the table, and glanced around. Everything was beautiful. Velvet chairs, chiffon curtains, white flowers, all arranged for a dream. Only the dreamer had awakened. A week earlier, while Ethan was away rehearsing for the wedding, Isabella stayed at his apartment. She wanted to organize the files, clear out old boxes, and make space for the life they were about to begin together. But when she opened the bottom drawer of his desk, she found a brown leather journal wedged between blueprints. The first page was yellowed, the handwriting neat, slightly slanted. "Clara is still the one I cannot forget. I thought time would fade everything, but it only made the memories more orderly." Isabella read it. Every line, every word. Each page revealed a fragment of the man she was about to marry, and every fragment belonged to someone else. One entry, written after a storm, read, "If I could go back, I'd learn to love without control." Another, more haunting, confessed, "I'm afraid that if I see her again, I'll look at her the same way I did the first time." Isabella closed the journal softly. No anger, no jealousy, just a deep, quiet understanding, and a sadness that felt almost tender. That evening, she sat alone on the balcony, the wind threading through her hair. A thought surfaced, faint at first, then so clear it made her tremble. If he still loves her, I want her to be there when he realizes it. Not to hurt anyone, but to stop before all three of them were trapped in a lie dressed as happiness. True love does not need possession. It only needs to be placed in the right place, even if that place is the past. And so she wrote Clara Monroe's address on an envelope. No signature, no return name, just a silent act, a final experiment of fate. Now, staring into the mirror, Isabella realized everything had unfolded exactly as she'd expected. And yet, it hurt far more than she thought it would. She had seen Ethan's eyes on the altar when he looked at Clara. It wasn't nostalgia, it was recognition, the look of a man who had never truly let go. She closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek, tracing a pale line through her makeup. "I can't marry a man who's still caught between two heartbeats," she whispered. The door opened again. This time it wasn't her assistant. It was Mrs. Monroe, Ethan's mother, elegant in a deep violet dress. She looked at the bride sitting alone and asked softly, "Are you all right, Isabella?" Isabella turned and gave a small nod. "I'm fine. Maybe it just isn't my day." Mrs. Monroe held her gaze for a long moment, then said gently, "If you truly love him, don't be afraid to lose him. But if you know he no longer belongs to you, holding on won't save anything." Isabella smiled faintly, her eyes clearer now. "I know, ma'am. That's why I'm letting him go, back to where his heart truly belongs." Mrs. Monroe said nothing more. Before leaving, she rested a hand on Isabella's shoulder and gave a light squeeze, firm enough to carry both sorrow and respect. When the door closed, Isabella looked around the room one last time. The mirror reflected a woman who was no longer an abandoned bride, but someone who had learned the grace of stopping before love became cruelty. Her voice, soft as a sigh, filled the room. If he still loves her, I wanted her to be there, so he would know. Outside, the rain thickened. Below, the golden glow of taxi lights rippled across puddles like a half-fulfilled promise, dissolving quietly into the night. Soul Stories fam, if you're watching on another channel, come home to us at Soul Stories, where tens of thousands of listeners and sharers come together. 2 days after the unfinished wedding, it rained again in New York. Tiny drops slid down the glass window, drawing long, quiet lines, like memories that didn't fade, only softened over time. Clara Monroe sat by the window of her rented apartment, watching people hurry beneath umbrellas. She hadn't left the city yet. There were still some matters with her business partners to settle, but that wasn't the real reason she stayed. Something inside her still felt unfinished. Since that day, the image of the bride in white had lingered in her mind, blending with the faint sound of a ring hitting the cold marble floor. She knew, however, unintentionally, that her presence had broken something fragile that day, and that thought weighed heavily on her heart. That afternoon, while signing papers at her architectural office, her phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. When she answered, the voice on the other end was calm, composed, yet carried an undertone of emotion too carefully contained. "This is Isabella Hart. If you have time, I'd like to meet you. Thompson's Cafe near Central Park. Today, 4 p.m. Clara paused for a few seconds, then softly replied, "I'll be there." The cafe was small, tucked beneath a canopy of rain-soaked trees. Raindrops traced down the glass windows, glimmering under the soft amber lights. Only a few patrons remained inside. Isabella sat at the far corner beside the window. No wedding gown, no chandelier lights, just a woman in a cream sweater, her hair tied low, her eyes deep yet serene. When Clara stepped in, Isabella stood and gave a polite nod. "Thank you for coming." Clara sat down, slightly unsure of how to begin. "Actually, I should be the one thanking you for agreeing to see me. And I owe you an apology, Isabella. My appearance that day, it might have ruined your wedding." Isabella looked at her for a long moment, then smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "You don't need to apologize, Clara, because the person who invited you, it was me." Clara froze, and her voice came out as a whisper. "You?" Isabella nodded, calm but firm. "Yes, I was the one who sent that envelope. I knew I shouldn't have, but I needed to know whether he loved me or the memory of you." The cafe went quiet. Only the ticking of the clock and the rhythm of the rain filled the silence. Clara lowered her gaze, fingers intertwined on the table. Then I suppose you know the answer now. Isabella gave a faint, bittersweet smile. Yes, and maybe it's better to know the truth than to live in a beautiful lie. She paused, then looked directly at Clara. I'm sorry if my choice caused you pain, but I couldn't start a marriage with the ghost of another woman living in his heart. Clara's eyes glistened. No, Isabella, you weren't wrong. If anything, I should thank you. If not for that day, I wouldn't have realized I still hadn't truly let go. Isabella smiled again, the kind of smile that comes after understanding one's own limits. She reached across the table and took Clara's hand. Warm, steady, sincere. I never meant to hurt anyone, Clara. But maybe, because of you, I've learned that sometimes stepping back is the kindest way to love. Clara's voice trembled, though her words were clear. You know, I used to think the one who came after was always the one who destroyed. But now I see, sometimes they're the ones who teach us how to release. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, the rain slowed, each drop tracing a quiet path across the glass, like time itself taking a breath. Isabella took a sip of her coffee, then said softly, He's a good man, but he doesn't yet know how to love without control. I think he needs time to learn how to love, not to possess. Clara gave a small nod, a gentle smile forming. You're right. I left 5 years ago, not because I stopped loving him, but because I was afraid I'd lose myself if I stayed. Maybe he was afraid of the same thing. Isabella's gaze turned toward the window, where the late afternoon light struggled to pierce through the rain. If someday he comes to you, let him speak. Whether you forgive him or not, at least give him the chance to be honest. Clara nodded softly. I will. Because sometimes the one trapped in the past isn't the person left behind. It's the one who walked away. They sat a while longer, no longer needing words. Between them was a quiet understanding. Two hearts that had both learned how to be gentle with themselves. Two women, two different paths, but both are choosing the same thing. Kindness. When they finally stood to leave, Isabella said, Do you know why I asked you to meet me here? Because Ethan once told me this was the cafe where you two signed your first contract together. I thought, maybe it's only right to let everything end where it once began. Clara smiled, light as breath. I remember this table. Back then, he hated sugar in his coffee, and I always added 2 spoons. Isabella's eyes softened, her smile trembling faintly. Maybe that's the reason. He always needed a little sweetness, but never knew how to give it to himself. Outside, the rain finally stopped. They walked out, each heading in a different direction. Neither turned back, but both carried a lighter heart. These two women didn't need to win. They only needed to understand. News travels faster than any explanation. Billionaire Ethan Monroe halts wedding mid-ceremony. Bride leaves Waldorf Astoria. Groom and ring left behind. Within a single night, Ethan Monroe's name flooded every headline. Photos spread like wildfire. Him standing in the middle of the ballroom, pale-faced, lavender petals scattered at his feet. People talked about pride, scandal, and secrets, but not about the truth that mattered most. 3 hearts had broken that day, each in a different way. The next morning, Ethan went to Isabella's apartment. The door opened. She stood there in a white robe, her hair loose, her face pale but calm. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. You don't have to explain, Ethan. He remained at the threshold, voice low and rough. I should anyway. She nodded slightly and stepped aside to let him in. The living room was still, filled only with the ticking of the clock. On the table lay the bridal bouquet, wilted now, its white petals curled like wounds after rain. Ethan looked around, hesitant even to sit. Isabella, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that. She gave a small smile. Sad, but not bitter. You don't need to apologize, Ethan. You only need to be honest. He fell silent. The words caught in his throat. Isabella watched him for a long time before continuing. I read your journal. He froze. I know I'm not the only one in your heart, she said softly. I thought time might help you forget her. But when that ring fell, I realized I wasn't standing in front of a man ready to marry me. I was standing in front of someone still trying to find his way back. Ethan lowered his head, his fist tightening. I never meant to hurt you. But when I saw Clara, everything I'd buried for 5 years came rushing back. I didn't know what to do, except stand still. And that silence, Isabella murmured, told me everything. A pause, and then she looked at him again, her voice still gentle. I'm not angry, Ethan. Maybe my love wasn't strong enough to make you forget someone else, but at least it's strong enough to let you go without hate. He looked up, eyes glistening. You deserve someone better than me. Maybe, she said with a faint, kind smile, but that doesn't make you a bad man. We just came at the wrong time, Ethan. She stepped closer and laid a hand on his shoulder. If you're still thinking about her, stop fighting it. Go find her, but this time, say the words you never said. He stared at her, unable to believe forgiveness could be that gentle. Thank you, Isabella. Don't thank me. Just live honestly. That's the only way to make things right. 4 nights after the wedding, Ethan still hadn't slept. He sat in his office, the pale glow of the laptop screen casting shadows across his tired face. On the desk lay an old photograph. He and Clara, standing before the first draft of the Modern Art Museum's design. She was laughing. He was looking at her, a fleeting moment that had somehow become the only thing he couldn't rebuild. He remembered their last night together, 5 years ago. Her eyes when she said, "You're trying to make everything perfect, but love doesn't need to be perfect." He hadn't replied, only stayed silent. That silence, he now realized, was not strength. It was the quiet that killed them. That night, Ethan shut his laptop, grabbed his coat, and left. He told no one. No driver, no company car. Just an old sedan and the road north to Vermont. Rain fell again, soft, persistent, like autumn's last breath. He drove 8 hours, stopping only when he saw the faint yellow glow of a small town nestled between the trees. At the end of a sloping road stood a wooden gate with a sign that read, Clara Monroe, Interior Design. The handwriting was hers, neat, gentle, deliberate. Her world now was simple, peaceful, and had no space for him. Ethan sat in the car, hands gripping the wheel. He didn't know whether to knock or turn away, but before he could decide, the door opened. Clara stepped out, wearing a gray sweater and a white wool scarf. The porch light framed her hair in a soft halo of mist. She didn't look surprised, didn't even flinch, just looked at him quietly, as if she'd known this moment would come. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her tone was calm, but her eyes trembled slightly. He swallowed hard and took a step forward. "If you hate me, say it. Just don't stay silent. Silence kills me slower than anything else." The words hung between them like a hairline crack in glass. She studied him for a long time, her gaze neither angry nor forgiving. "I don't hate you, Ethan. I'm just afraid that if we go back, I'll lose myself again." He lowered his head. "I know. And maybe that's exactly why I lost you." They stood there in silence, only the sound of wind moving through the pines and the soft hum of mist between them. Ethan looked at her and saw the traces of time, faint lines near her eyes, a few silver threads in her brown hair. She was still beautiful, but not in the way she used to be. Now it was the beauty of someone who had walked through loss and still chosen kindness. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to say he had never stopped loving her. He wanted to say that not a single day in 5 years had passed without her shadow crossing his mind. But when he finally spoke, only breath came out in the fog. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know, I understand now." She tilted her head slightly. "Understand what?" "That love doesn't mean holding on. And that perfection means nothing if the person beside you no longer smiles." She smiled faintly, a soft, ghost-like smile, like moonlight lost behind clouds. "It's too late, Ethan. But at least you finally said it." A gust of wind swept through, carrying the scent of pine and roasted coffee from somewhere nearby. They both looked up at the gray sky, rain fading into mist. In that dim light, the distance between them was both close and unbearably far. "Are you happy?" he asked, voice hoarse. "I'm at peace," she said. Then after a pause, "And you?" He pressed his lips together. "I'm learning to live with what I lost." They looked at each other. No words, no tears. What once was love still flickered faintly between them, like a fragile light behind heavy clouds. But it wasn't love anymore. Only truth in two people who had changed too much to go back. When he turned to leave, Clara called softly, "Ethan." He stopped. "Thank you for finally saying what you never did." He nodded, lowering his eyes. "And thank you for listening, even though I no longer deserve it." He walked into the fog, his figure fading behind the trees. Clara stood there for a long time until the headlights disappeared completely. Against the pale mist, a drop slid down her cheek. She couldn't tell if it was rain or a tear. That morning, Vermont was wrapped in a thin veil of mist. The sun had not yet broken through the clouds. Only a pale silver light lay across the fields. Clara Monroe was brewing coffee in her small kitchen when she heard a knock on the door. She opened it. Ethan Monroe stood there, looking different from the night before. It was still the same pair of eyes, but the storm inside them was gone. All that remained was weariness and a calmness that only comes after a long journey through oneself. In his hands was a small wooden box, old and slightly scratched at the corners. He held it with both hands as though it contained something fragile. "I didn't come to confuse you again," he said softly. "I just wanted to give you this, and then I'll go." She didn't speak, just stepped aside for him to enter. The space between them smelled of coffee and pine, warm yet distant. Ethan placed the box on the table and slowly opened it. Inside lay a stack of aged envelopes tied together with a thin silver ribbon. Each envelope carried the same handwriting, "To C.M." Clara exhaled, her gaze trembling. "You wrote these? When?" Ethan looked down, his voice rough. "From the first month after you left. One letter every month, 5 years, 63 in total. But I never sent them. I didn't know where to send them, or if I still had the right to." She touched the ribbon with her fingertips, her hands slightly shaking, as if touching a memory that still had thorns. "Why did you keep them?" "Because I was afraid," he said. "Afraid that if you read them, you'd see I hadn't changed. And afraid that if you didn't, I'd never get to say what needed to be said." She opened the first envelope. The paper was yellowed, the ink faint, the handwriting leaning slightly. Familiar. Month 1. "I still try to believe I was right. But a house without your laughter isn't a home anymore." She pressed her lips together and opened another. Month 11. "I realized work can't fill the silence. No matter how perfect the design, it means nothing without someone who understands why it was created." A single drop fell on the page. She wasn't sure if it came from the rain outside or her own tears. Then she reached the 32nd letter, the handwriting darker, trembling slightly. "I used to think love meant holding on, but maybe love is letting the other person breathe so they never have to ask permission to be themselves." She stopped. Her hands shook, her eyes blurred. Not out of sorrow, but because finally he understood. Ethan stood silent. He hadn't come for forgiveness, only to show her that her words hadn't fallen into the void. Clara looked up, her voice thick with emotion. "You really have changed, Ethan." He smiled faintly, lowering his gaze. "Maybe because of you. People only start to learn after losing what they thought would always stay." She gently closed the letters, tied the ribbon again, and returned them to the box. "Where will you go now?" He shrugged softly. "I don't know. Maybe back to New York, or maybe to Florence, the place you once said you wanted to open a design exhibit. I heard there are old buildings there, where architecture and light breathe together." She smiled, a quiet warmth in her voice. "You remembered." "How could I forget?" he said. Silence settled again. No one cried. No one tried to stretch the moment longer than it was meant to last. Outside, sunlight began to seep through the fog, glinting on the wooden frame and spilling over the table where the little box of letters sat quietly between them. Ethan looked at her and said softly, "Thank you for reading them. What I wrote wasn't to bring you back. It was to learn how to leave the right way." She rose, walked to him, and placed her hand gently on his. No embrace, just a touch, enough to say everything. Nothing is ever truly lost, Ethan. Some things are just not mature enough yet to be kept. He nodded, eyes glistening but calm. I know, and for the first time, I feel light. They walked to the door together. Morning light shimmered across the wet road outside. Ethan stopped on the porch and turned back. Clara stood beneath the eaves, her hair lifting slightly in the breeze. Both smiled, fragile but real. As he walked away, she watched him go, her heart no longer heavy. In her hands, the wooden box was still warm, carrying the breath of a chapter that had finally closed, the way it was always meant to. 1 year later. New York still glittered as always, but it no longer swallowed Ethan Monroe whole. He was still the CEO of Monroe Atelier, still featured in business magazines, still called the Master of Light and Space. Only now, every month, he disappeared for a few days. No meetings, no schedule, no phone. His staff called it the quiet week. He called it the week to keep a promise. The black car rolled down a narrow country road toward Vermont. On both sides, lavender stretched into a sea of purple, rippling to the foot of the hills. When the wind swept through, its fragrance filled the cabin, the scent of an old promise finally fulfilled. Clara was waiting by the wooden gate, her hair tied loosely, her linen dress the color of cream, fluttering in the breeze. She looked as peaceful as the land itself. "You're late," she said, smiling softly. "Traffic," he replied, and then stopped, his gaze tender. "But I came just like I promised." She smiled again. A simple sentence, yet it carried a year's worth of quiet change. Two people who had once lost each other, now learning how to return without hurting anyone. The small patch of land on the hillside had once been the place where they sketched a garden together. Now it was real. A small wooden house stood under the sunlight, surrounded by rows of lavender and young maple trees. On the fence hung a sign, Phoenix Atelier, a place to rebuild. It wasn't a company, but a foundation. Ethan funded it. Clara ran it. Together they restored old structures and opened design classes for rural children. The kids called him Mr. E and her Ms. C. Each morning he worked from the porch for a few hours, managing Monroe Atelier from afar. Each afternoon he rolled up his sleeves and helped the children mix soil and paint wood. Far from the cold, exacting CEO the world once knew. Yet perhaps, for the first time, he was truly alive. One evening, the sunset spilled golden honey across the garden. Clara carried out 2 glasses of lemonade and set them on the table. Ethan was kneeling by the flower beds, placing a small wooden sign that read, "Lavender Field, the Promise Corner." "The Promise Corner?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. He smiled. "The place where I finally kept my word. Remember what I said? If one day I get tired of New York, I'll take you to Vermont to grow lavender." I thought it was a joke, but turns out I never forgot. She looked at him, quiet for a long time, then whispered, "I once thought that promise would stay unfinished forever." "It didn't," he said softly, "because some things don't need to be reborn. They just need to be completed." The wind carried the sweet scent of lavender between them. A few petals drifted down, landing on their hands. Clara picked one up and placed it gently in his palm. "Still busy with New York?" she asked. "Still," he said with a small laugh, "but now I know when to turn off my phone." "So you've learned to rest?" "Not exactly rest," he replied, "just to breathe." She laughed, a sound clear and warm like sunlight through glass. He watched her, then said quietly, "I'm not asking to start over, Clara. I'm just asking to keep walking with you, even if only as a friend." She tilted her head, her eyes soft, glowing with a warmth that could not be named. "Some things don't need new names to be real." Her words fell light as the wind, and in that moment, they both understood some bonds don't need to be tied again, because they were never truly broken. When night fell, they lit the lamps in the garden. Golden light spilled along the path. The children had gone home. Only the 2 of them remained, rebuilding dreams from ashes. Clara opened her sketchbook and handed it to him. It showed her design for Phoenix Studio, a small classroom among the flowers where children could draw and build models. Ethan looked, smiled, then took a pencil and added a few strokes. "You're editing my design again?" she teased. "No," he said, chuckling. "Just finishing it. With you." She smiled back, unbothered. Their hands moved across the paper together, just like years ago when they had designed the art museum. But now they drew not for prestige or contracts, only for the simplest reason: to create something with heart. When they finally stood up, the lamps glowed across the entire garden. Lavender swayed gently, its purple sheen catching the soft gold of the lights. Ethan turned to her and said quietly, "Thank you for letting me keep my promise, even if it came years late." She smiled. "And thank you for still being you. Only now you know when to stop." They didn't touch hands. They didn't need to. They simply stood side by side, watching the sunset fade over the garden. They had built a garden not of second chances, but of peace, gratitude, and the quiet beauty of things finally done right. That day, Vermont glowed like honey. Phoenix Atelier was hosting its first seasonal fundraiser for Little Hands, a program that taught children to build models and draw architecture. The garden overflowed with laughter. Children running through rows of lavender, clutching paper modules still sticky with glue, their giggles fluttering like wind through violet blooms. Clara stood beneath the wooden porch, sketchbook in hand, watching the little ones building miniature rooftops. Not far away, Ethan bent down beside a boy, showing him how to balance a beam. Sunlight spilled over his shoulders, wrapping him in quiet peace. The peace of a man who had finally chosen the life he wanted to live. A black SUV stopped at the wooden gate. Clara turned at the sound. The door opened, and Isabella Hart stepped out. Linen dress the color of sand, straw hat, a warm, radiant smile. Beside her was a tall man in his 40s, with calm eyes, a kind expression, the sort of man who didn't speak much, but when he did, it counted. Isabella looked around, then spotted Clara. Her smile widened as she waved. "Clara!" They embraced, a brief but firm hug, like a bridge closing the last distance between old misunderstandings. "Welcome to Phoenix," Clara said warmly. "And this is?" Isabella turned. "This is Daniel. He works with a community health foundation. We're hoping to collaborate. Sensory and light therapy classes for kids on the autism spectrum." Daniel shook Clara's hand, his grip steady, kind, grounding. "I've heard a lot about this place," he said. "Seeing it in person, it really does have a heartbeat." From across the garden, Ethan looked up. He saw Isabella and Daniel. Surprise flickered, then settled into calm. He walked over, smiling faintly. "Welcome to Phoenix." They shook hands, not as people with history, but as friends who had both survived it. No awkwardness, no shadows of the past. Just the quiet certainty that time and honesty had done their best work. Healing. The four of them sat beneath a vine-covered pergola, the air scented with lavender. Children buzzed around them. Volunteers set out lemonade, butter cookies, and a basket of red apples. Isabella shared about her year, her travels, the small projects she'd joined, the art of sleeping well again. She told them about meeting Daniel at a community clinic, where she'd gone to write a feature on early intervention programs. "He said love isn't about possession," Isabella smiled, glancing at Daniel. "It's about understanding." Daniel chuckled softly. "Actually, I said, don't try to fix people like you, fix a leaky roof. The poetry's all hers." Laughter rippled around the table. Ethan laughed too, a rare, quiet laugh that sounded like leaves brushing in the breeze. And in that sound, Clara realized the darkness was gone. They discussed children, sustainable materials, and the idea that instead of teaching kids to draw beautiful houses, they should teach them to place windows where the wind blows. Daniel offered to donate sensory materials, sand, fabric, and chimes, so that children afraid of touch could learn about the world in a gentle way. Ethan took notes. Clara suggested adding a light and shadow corner for kids sensitive to brightness. As the afternoon mellowed, the children went out to water the garden. Isabella reached into her bag and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. "I brought this," she said, placing it on the table. "Not for either of you, for both of you." Clara hesitated, then slid it toward Ethan. He opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Isabella's script was graceful, firm, calm. He read silently, but her voice, in some tender way, seemed to fill the air. To my two friends, I've thought a lot about that day. The fallen ring, the glances, the silence. There are loves that don't end when someone leaves, but when someone is brave enough to stop. Thank you, Clara, for coming, for saving me from a marriage I would have had to lie my way through. Thank you, Ethan, for standing still, for helping me see it was time to go. Over the past year, I've learned that love isn't about winning, it's about understanding, knowing what others need to be themselves, and where we can stand without making it harder for them to breathe. I hope Phoenix grows the way our hearts did, quietly, steadily, without the need to prove anything, just shining by being true. And if one day the wind passes through this garden, remember, we once chose to stand on the side of light. When Ethan folded the letter, his eyes were wet, but bright. She's stronger than either of us ever knew, he murmured. Clara looked at him. In that moment, she saw a different Ethan. No longer armored by ambition, no longer haunted by regret. Just a man who could smile, listen, and let the wind pass without needing to catch it. Isabella laughed softly. Don't make me sound noble. I only did what was right. Daniel taught me that. Daniel shook his head. No, you chose that yourself. A gentle breeze stirred the pergola vines. Sunlight shimmered into golden flecks on the wooden table, across the letter, and over the four hands resting nearby. The children came running back, one tugging Ethan's sleeve, another shouting, Ms. Clara, look! I put the window right here. Daniel bent down to tie a loose shoelace. Isabella pulled a sheet of window-shaped stickers from her bag and laughed. Who wants a window with a heart on it? The laughter rose like bells through the air. As dusk settled, the lavender deepened to royal purple. The horizon turned to soft orange, fading into blue. Clara stood by the porch railing beside Ethan, watching Isabella and Daniel help the children stack their paper houses on a long wooden table, all of them laughing when one tiny roof leaned toward the sun. See that? Ethan nodded toward it. They turned the roof to face the light. Because they know where the light is, Clara said, her eyes shimmering. No one had to tell them. He was quiet for a long moment, then said softly, almost to himself, Light has always been there. We just have to be calm enough to turn toward it. Clara looked at him, and the man before her was no longer shadowed by the darkness that once followed him. He was lighter, and so her heart was too. As the evening wound down, Isabella came up the porch steps and hugged Clara again. Thank you for building a place like this. Thank you for coming back, Clara said, to close everything. With light. Isabella turned to Ethan and offered her hand. I wish you happiness, the kind you can breathe in. Thank you, Ethan said, shaking her hand, and thank you for the letter. Daniel gave Ethan a friendly nudge. I'll bring a few wind chimes next time. Kids love the sound of wind. Ethan smiled. Phoenix loves everything that moves with the wind. They said their goodbyes. The SUV rolled away down the dirt path, leaving behind a shimmer of golden dust in the fading light. Clara watched until the car disappeared behind the trees. Beside her, Ethan unfolded the letter once more. The inked words glowed faintly in the amber dusk. He folded it carefully, tucking it into his inner pocket, like a small, sacred charm. Tomorrow, he said quietly, I'll build that light and wine corner for the kids, so they can learn how to turn their windows. She smiled. Yes, and maybe how to turn their hearts too. They stood there, not touching, no promises left to make. Somewhere in the garden, the wind drifted through lavender, carrying peace, the kind that comes only when truth is finally spoken and everyone has chosen the side of light. When truth walks in, darkness doesn't fight. It simply steps aside, making room for what was always meant to belong. A full year had passed since Phoenix Atelier first opened its doors. What was once a barren slope on the edge of Vermont had blossomed into a living, breathing sanctuary. Glass-walled classrooms flooded with sunlight, walls covered in children's drawings, and everywhere, the mingling scent of lavender and laughter. Across the main gate, a white ribbon banner fluttered in the wind. Phoenix Atelier, 1-year anniversary. Neighbors, donors, and old friends gathered, though no one called it a grand event. They simply called it a day, made beautiful by gratitude. Backstage, Clara straightened a stack of notes. She wore a pale blue dress, her hair tied back neatly. The stage lights spilled through the curtains, painting her face in soft gold. Outside, rows of wooden chairs were filled. Children's chatter blended with the rustle of lavender petals scattered along the aisle. Ethan appeared behind her, his reflection overlapping hers in the mirror. "Ready?" She turned, smiling gently. "A year ago, you asked me the same thing, but it was about launching the foundation. Do you remember how nervous I was?" He nodded, eyes warm. "I do. And I told you, every structure begins with a deep breath." They both smiled. Then she took that breath and walked onto the stage. Golden light bathed the room. The audience fell silent. Clara stood at the center, microphone in hand. Behind her, the Phoenix logo glimmered, a pair of wings opening into a clear sky. Her voice, calm but full of feeling, carried across the hall. "1 year ago, Phoenix was nothing more than a sketch on an old page. We had no long-term plan, no grand promise, only a belief that from what had fallen apart, something beautiful could grow again." A small pause, then, softly but with quiet conviction, she added, "Forgiveness doesn't change the past, but it changes the future we're walking into." The line lingered in the air. Ethan stood in the wings, hands clasped, eyes on her, pride and peace shining where once there had been restlessness. By the time the ceremony ended, the sun had dipped low behind the hills. Guests began to leave. The air smelled of lavender and twilight. Clara slipped off her heels and stepped barefoot onto the gravel path. Ethan fell into stride beside her, hands in his coat pockets, his expression easy and unguarded. They followed the trail behind the center, where a small lake mirrored the changing sky, orange melting into rose, then into violet dusk. For a while, neither spoke. Only the chirping of crickets and their quiet breaths filled the space between them. "Do you remember the first day here?" Clara asked. "I do," he said. "You told me this place had nothing, just dirt and wind. And you said that was enough to start." They both laughed softly. A breeze drifted across the lavender fields, scattering a few petals onto the lake's glassy surface. Ethan stopped, turning toward her. Light shimmered in his eyes, part sunset, part reflection from the glass building behind them. "For the first time," he said quietly, "I feel at peace. Not because I have you, but because you're happy." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She didn't answer right away. A glimmer danced on the water. Perhaps a reflection from the lanterns, or maybe a tear she hadn't noticed falling. Then she stepped closer, resting her head lightly on his shoulder. Not out of rekindled love, but because, in that moment, she understood. Love never disappears. It only changes form to survive. In the distance, Phoenix Atelier glowed like a constellation come to earth. Inside the glass hall, children hung paper lanterns, each one representing something forgiven. Ethan watched the scene with quiet awe. "You've turned this place into something far beyond architecture," he murmured. She smiled. "We did." He nodded, his voice low. "I've built a lot in my life, but only here I finally learned what it means to live." The wind stirred again, carrying the faint sweetness of lavender and the dampness of the earth. The lanterns began to drift across the lake, tiny orbs of light floating like a handmade Milky Way. Clara watched them, her voice barely above a whisper. "Forgiveness is like those lanterns. You never know where they'll go, but the moment you let them go, your heart becomes lighter." Ethan didn't reply. He just reached out and gently held her hand. And for the first time in years, his hand wasn't cold. Above them, the sky deepened into indigo. Below, the water shimmered with hundreds of moving lights, and somewhere between them, between what was lost and what was found, peace finally took shape. Snow began to fall by late afternoon. The first flakes of the season, light as memory, slowly blanketed the wooden rooftops of Phoenix Atelier. All of Vermont seemed to hold its breath. Only the amber glow from inside spilled through the windows, glinting on the melting snow. A faint jazz melody played in the background, soft, steady, like a heartbeat that finally found its rhythm. A few volunteers were still tidying up after the anniversary celebration, but soon only 2 figures remained on the second-floor balcony. Ethan and Clara, overlooking the lavender garden, now sleeping beneath a thin layer of white. Clara wrapped a gray scarf around her neck, hands cradling a mug of hot cocoa. Her eyes shimmered with the light of all the days that had brought her here. Ethan stepped out, draping his coat gently over her shoulders. No words. They stood together, watching the snow drift through the warm lamplight. Memories falling, melting, and yet leaving a glimmer behind on the ground. Tonight, time seemed to have two heartbeats. One of the present's warmth, snow, and quiet light, and one of the past applause, chandeliers, and the sound of a ring striking marble at the Waldorf Astoria. That sound still echoed in her mind sometimes, soft as an old refrain. Clara closed her eyes, and in the blur of snow, she saw herself again. The forgotten bride, the woman who once chose to walk away while the whole room watched. Flashback, Waldorf Astoria, years ago. The ballroom glowed with brilliance. She stood by the door, her silver-gray dress glinting like moonlight that had lost its warmth. When the ring slipped from Ethan's hand, time stilled. Isabella's voice trembled. "Maybe we should stop here." And the crowd held its breath. Clara didn't cry. She didn't rage. She only understood. This was the moment she would keep her dignity intact. She turned, opened the heavy doors, and stepped out. Cold air rushed in, lifting her veil like a farewell. Behind her, whispers, her name. The echo of a wedding song cut short. Before her, New York's rain shimmered through the city lights. Blurred, endless. She walked. She didn't look back. Back to the present. Clara opened her eyes. Snow still fell. Soft, hushed, covering the stairs, the railing, and the garden asleep below. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, voice barely above the sound of the wind. "I'm remembering," Ethan said quietly, "the day you walked away. Over 6 years now. I still remember," he admitted, "but when I do now, it doesn't hurt. I just think maybe that moment saved us both." She turned, a faint smile curving her lips. "I didn't walk away to punish you. I know. I walked away because if I'd stayed, I would have lost myself. And maybe you would have lost the very thing you loved about me." Ethan didn't speak. Snow landed on his hair and melted into thin drops sliding down his temple. He looked at her then, with a small, breathless smile. "Thank you for walking away, Clara." She held his gaze, her eyes deep and calm, as though within them was both the sunset and the snow. "And thank you," she whispered, "for letting me." Below them, the lavender garden slept under its white quilt. The paper lanterns from the children's celebration still hung from the trees, glowing faintly, each a different hue, like small fragments of hope illuminating the winter night. Clara followed the soft flicker of light with her eyes. "When I left that wedding," she said, "I thought it was an ending. But it turned out to be the beginning of learning to love myself again." Ethan's voice was low, steady. "When you left, I thought I'd lost everything. But it was only then that I started finding what was human in me again." They stood in silence, the kind that doesn't weigh heavily, but heals. Then he turned and took her hand. Not tightly, not possessively, just enough for warmth to pass between them. "I don't know what we are, Clara," he said softly, "but I know this. This place, Vermont, Phoenix, this garden, it only means something because you walked away to find it." She nodded slowly. "Maybe love isn't about staying," she said. "Maybe it's about knowing when to leave and when to return." The wind rose, swirling snowflakes around them before letting them fall again, gently to rest. The flakes melted into shining beads on the wooden railings. Far off, the lake reflected the golden lights of the atelier, a mirror of memory, glowing and fading with every ripple. Clara took a small step closer. Ethan turned, his hand still in hers. No words were needed anymore. Everything that mattered had already been said. In silence, she smiled, a soft, knowing smile, and for the first time, they weren't the people they used to be, just two souls who had once been lost, now standing side by side, watching the snow dissolve into spring. Inside, the last light of the atelier flickered through the windows. Children's lanterns still shimmered beyond the glass, tiny symbols of forgiveness, floating in the air between yesterday and tomorrow. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing footprints, softening edges, covering everything in white. And in that purity, there was no regret, only peace. She walked away once, not to punish him, but to find herself. And when she returned, love no longer needed to be spoken. It was already there. They stood together until the lights dimmed and the snow turned to mist. Two people, two pasts, one quiet truth. Sometimes walking away isn't the end of love. It's how love begins again.